Hello, grade 10s. Welcome to part 2 of the nitrogen cycle. We're going to be taking a look at how humans impact biogeochemical cycles, including that of nitrogen. Now, one of the big contributors to the nitrogen cycle is our use of fertilizers. Before about the 1950s, people mostly used natural fertilizers, things like manure, on their fields to help the plants grow. Some areas didn't have a lot of nitrogen, they had poor soil, and so to help the plants grow, they would use the manure, which is the poop that was from animals that typically ate plants. That nitrogen that had gone through their systems and being pushed out as waste could be used by plants in future years and would provide a richer soil for the plants to grow. However, after the 1950s, we started making synthetic fertilizer. And by 1999, slightly before you guys were born, we were at a point where we were actually fixing more nitrogen artificially than was being done by nature. Now, any kind of poop will contain nitrogen. The manure found from plant-eating animals like cows or sheep is actually containing a good amount of nitrogen that can be used by the plants. But manure that would come from a meat-eating animal, like a dog, a cat, or even a human, would have a very high concentration of nitrogen in it from all the protein and the meat that they eat. So human waste has to be processed. And up until just a few years back, 20, 30 years, in some places, raw sewage would get dumped straight into waterways and would produce very large amounts of nitrogen in those waterways. That caused severe problems in the water pathways that we'll talk about coming up here in a few slides. Another way nitrogen gets into the nitrogen cycle is by burning fossil fuels, things like oil and coal. Fertilizers and sewage aren't the only things that are contributing. Whenever we burn oil and coal, we put nitrogen that came originally from the plants and animals that produce the oil and coal into the air. In fact, human activities add up to 140 million tons of excess nitrogen into our atmosphere every year. The problem with all this excess nitrogen is we get to something called nitrogen saturation. Remember when we had our student teacher, Ms. Canning, tell us about carbon saturation. More was going into the system than could be used. It couldn't sustain anymore, it couldn't hold anymore. Well, the same thing happens with nitrogen. We can get to a point where there's so much nitrogen around that plants can't use it up to grow anymore. There's more than they can use. And so what happens in these cases, when there's more nitrogen in the soil than the plants can use, is that excess nitrogen gets washed away and it ends up also in our waterways. Now, once nitrogen saturation happens, it causes the acidity of the soil to increase. These nitrates, when they mix with water, can form nitric acid, and that makes your soil acidic. This will damage trees' roots. It will stunt tree growth, cause needles to turn yellow. The acidic soil dissolves toxic metals out of the soil, like aluminum or mercury or lead, and that can damage the plant. And also, if we eat plants that have absorbed this stuff up through their roots and incorporated them into their bodies, we risk making ourselves sick. So those toxic metals that normally would have sat rather undisturbed in the soil now are available for uptake by a plant's roots. In the atmosphere, when we burn fossil fuels, we are also putting nitrates up into the air. And when those mix with rain, they can form nitric acid. Now, nitric acid is one of the main components in acid precipitation, things like acid rain, or in northern climates like ours, acid snow. In fact, in Canada, over 150,000 lakes have been so damaged by acid precipitation that fish get killed, birds and insects, amphibians, a lot of species can't live in this acidified water. Right now, we can only do Band-Aid solutions. We can put chemicals like limestone, which is a base, into the water to help neutralize it. But as soon as more acid rain falls, it goes acidic again. So that doesn't fix the actual problem. It just sort of takes care of it for the moment. This is an interesting graphic. I like seeing how the industry here is pumping lots of fossil fuels up into the air. Things like cars and planes and other automobiles also pump lots of fossil fuels up into the air. These acidic gases, things that have nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxides, carbon gases, can get carried by the wind, and they can go downwind long, long ways before rain eventually dissolves them, turns them into acid, and then causes acid rain, sometimes far away from the source of the pollution. When that acid rain or acid precipitation starts getting into our lakes and rivers, or when excess nitrogen from our ground, from fertilizer, starts getting into our lakes and rivers, we end up with nitrogen saturation problems, and we end up with that problem that I said I was going to talk about called eutrophication. Eutrophication is a problem when we get too many nutrients into the body of a lake or a river. Eutrophication is a 5-step process. First step, runoff of excess nitrogen, usually from fertilizers, goes into the water systems. Then, the nitrogen causes algae, which is a greenish-colored floating type plant in the water, to grow like crazy. It's like, hooray, there's lots of food for me, and it grows like crazy. It's very healthy. You've probably seen algae if you've gone swimming in the summer, and you see this greenish, slimy stuff floating in the water, and you don't very much like to swim in it. The problem with those algae is that, one, when they die, they sink to the bottom and start to rot, but also they create kind of a big blanket on the surface of the water that blocks the lake from the plants living in there. So the plants, who also need sunlight to live, will also die and start to rot. This rotting plants and algae is being accomplished by the work of bacteria and other decomposers, and these guys need oxygen just like we do in order to live. So there's so many of them decomposing all of these dead plants that they start to use up all the oxygen in the lake, and finally there's so little oxygen in that lake or river that the fish that live in that system can die, and now effectively we have got a dead lake. We started off by giving it too much good stuff, too much nitrogen. We ended up by killing everything that lived in it. In this slide, we see the process of eutrophication. We have nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus going into the lake. Now, phosphorus used to get into our lakes and rivers through a chemical called phosphates. Phosphates were added to soaps and detergents to help them clean better. And after about 1970, 1980, these were banned in lots of soaps and detergents because so much eutrophication was happening. However, we still have excess nitrogen going into our lakes and rivers. Either way, these nutrients go in and cause an increase in our algae to grow. The algae block the light that's coming from the sun, and that kills other plants like sedge grass. The grasses die, the algae die, they all end up at the bottom of the lake and start to decay. The decaying process uses up all the oxygen in the lake, and then the fish that would live there don't have enough oxygen to live, and they die. At this point, actually, our lakes actually look very clear and crystal and sparkly because there's nothing living in them. Unfortunately, that is our dead lake. So just like in freshwater ecosystems, we can get these algal blooms happening in marine ecosystems, saltwater systems. The type of algae that live in these systems are quite often red in color, and we end up calling these red tides. Unfortunately, the chemicals produced by red tides, that red algae, is very poisonous to mammals. And so any kind of a shellfish like clam or a mussel or even a lobster that might be down at the bottom eating up stuff on the floor of the ocean that was under a red tide now has a body full of these poisons, and if we were to eat them, we would get very sick and could die. Here's a picture of red tides. You can see the red color that is in the ocean here. And so there's also lots of mussels and clams and other things that people would normally be safe to eat. Unfortunately, during a red tide, anything that these animals have eaten is poisonous to us. So I'm going to get you guys to work on your next task, which is about task 9, I believe, which is the process about eutrophication. There's a little story about a fish named Jaws, and I want you to read the little story and try and write up a quick paragraph on what's happening to the fish based on what you've just learned about eutrophication.